Marcus Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, gazing down at the sprawling city below. At 45, he had built an empire worth $12 billion, yet the view that once filled him with pride now seemed distant and cold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass towers he owned, each one a monument to his relentless pursuit of wealth and power. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Blackwood, the board meeting is in 10 minutes, Sarah announced, her voice respectful but firm. She had worked for him for 8 years and knew better than anyone how to navigate his moods. Marcus nodded without turning around. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." His reflection in the window showed a man who had everything money could buy but seemed to lack something fundamental. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit handmade in Italy, yet his eyes held a weariness that no amount of success could cure. The board meeting proceeded as usual. Quarterly reports, profit margins, acquisition targets, all numbers that once excited him but now felt mechanical. Marcus listened with half his attention while his mind wandered to a strange dream he had been having for weeks. In it, he heard whispers coming from deep underground, voices that seemed to call his name with an urgency he couldn't understand. "The Henderson property acquisition is complete," announced his chief financial officer, pulling Marcus back to reality. "We now own the entire block, including that old mansion on Elm Street." Marcus frowned. "The Victorian house. I thought the owner refused to sell. She passed away last month." The estate was eager to close quickly. The CFO shuffled through his papers. "Though I should mention, the previous owner left specific instructions about the basement. Something about it being sealed for safety reasons." A chill ran down Marcus's spine, though he couldn't explain why. What kind of safety reasons? "Structural issues, according to the documentation. The basement has been locked and untouched for decades." That evening, Marcus found himself driving through the old part of the city, something he rarely did. His usual route took him through the modern business district to his gated community, but tonight felt different. Almost without conscious decision, he turned onto Elm Street and parked in front of the Victorian mansion his company had just acquired. The house stood like a forgotten memory among the newer buildings. Its Gothic architecture seemed to whisper stories of a bygone era, when this part of the city was home to the wealthy elite. Now it looked out of place, surrounded by modern apartments and small businesses. Marcus stepped out of his car and approached the wrought iron gate. The evening air carried an unusual stillness, as if the very atmosphere around the house held its breath. He used his master key to unlock the front door, surprising himself with his boldness. He rarely involved himself in property details, preferring to let his managers handle such matters. The interior smelled of dust and forgotten time. Furniture covered in white sheets created ghostly shapes in the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. Marcus pulled out his phone's flashlight and began exploring the main floor. The craftsmanship was exquisite, hand-carved moldings, marble fireplaces, and stained glass windows that would have cost a fortune even today. As he walked through the dining room, he heard it. A faint whisper, so soft he almost dismissed it as the house settling. But then it came again, and this time he was certain it was his name. "Marcus!" He froze, his heart beating faster than it had in years. The sound seemed to come from below, just like in his dreams. Moving slowly, he found a door that led to what appeared to be a basement stairway. The wood was old but solid, and despite the warnings about structural issues, it seemed stable enough. The whisper came again, clearer now. "Marcus, come." Against every rational thought in his mind, he began descending the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, and the temperature seemed to drop with every foot he descended. His phone's light barely penetrated the darkness ahead, creating dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. The basement was larger than he had expected, with stone walls that looked far older than the house above. The whispers grew stronger here, not louder, but more insistent, as if multiple voices were calling to him from different directions. He swept his light across the room, revealing old furniture, stored paintings, and what looked like a collection of books and documents. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. Unlike the others, it was made of different stone, darker and more weathered. As he approached, the whispers became almost conversational, though he couldn't make out specific words. It was as if an entire crowd was speaking just below the threshold of understanding. Marcus pressed his hand against the wall and gasped. It was warm, impossibly warm for stone that should have been cold in this underground space. The whispers intensified, and, for a moment, he could swear he felt the wall pulse like a heartbeat beneath his palm. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, to call his security team, to do anything but stand here touching a warm stone wall in a basement that wasn't supposed to be safe. But something deeper, something he had never acknowledged before, kept him frozen in place. The whispers seemed to form words now, fragmented but recognizable. "Help us, trapped so long." Marcus jerked his hand back, but the warmth lingered on his palm. His entire worldview, built on logic and calculated risks, began to crumble. He was a man who believed in spreadsheets and profit margins, not ghost stories and supernatural whispers. Yet here he stood, in a basement that shouldn't exist according to safety reports, listening to voices that couldn't possibly be real, feeling warmth from stone that should have been cold. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Blackwood felt something he had forgotten existed, genuine fear mixed with overwhelming curiosity. He backed away from the wall, but couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he sat down on an old wooden crate and tried to process what was happening. The whispers continued, sometimes urgent, sometimes pleading, always just beyond full comprehension. As he sat there in the darkness, Marcus realized that despite his billions, despite his power and influence, he knew nothing about the world he actually lived in. He had spent decades building walls around himself, financial, emotional, and physical, only to discover that the real mysteries lay not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in places like this forgotten basement. The whispers seemed to sense his change in attitude. They became gentler, almost welcoming, as if acknowledging his decision to stay and listen. Marcus found himself leaning forward, straining to understand what they were trying to tell him. Hours passed without his notice. His phone battery died, leaving him in complete darkness except for the faint warmth emanating from the strange wall. But, instead of feeling lost, he felt more present than he had in years. The constant noise in his head, stock prices, meeting schedules, profit projections, had gone silent, replaced by something he couldn't name but desperately needed. Marcus spent the entire next day in a state of distraction that alarmed his staff. During the morning executive meeting, he stared out the window while his vice president discussed a merger worth $300 million. When asked for his input, he simply nodded and said, "Handle it." His assistant Sarah exchanged worried glances with other executives, knowing this was completely unlike their detail-oriented boss. By afternoon, Marcus had gathered everything he thought he might need: high-powered LED lights, a digital recorder, his laptop, and a thermal imaging camera he had ordered online and had delivered within hours. He also brought a crowbar and hammer, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something told him he might need to break through that warm stone wall. The drive to Elm Street felt different in daylight. The Victorian mansion looked less mysterious, but somehow more substantial, as if it had gained weight and presence overnight. Marcus parked and noticed an elderly man working in the garden of the house next door. The man looked up and waved, then walked over to the fence separating the properties. "You must be the new owner," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Frank Morrison. Lived here 43 years. Marcus shook his hand, noting the genuine warmth in the older man's grip. "Marcus Blackwood, what can you tell me about this house?" Frank's expression grew serious. "Depends on what you want to know. The Hendersons were good people, kept to themselves mostly. But that house..." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "That house has a history." "What kind of history?" "The kind people don't like talking about." Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone on the street. "Built in 1847 by Theodore Ashworth, a man who made his fortune in ways that weren't entirely legal, if you catch my meaning. Strange things happened in that house, even back then. Servants quit without explanation, visitors left in the middle of the night, and old Theodore himself started talking to empty rooms toward the end." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What happened to him? "Found dead in his basement in 1863. Natural causes," they said. But He was only 42 and healthy as a horse the week before. Frank glanced at the house, then back at Marcus. The Hendersons sealed that basement in 1961 after their daughter started having nightmares about voices calling her name. Sweet little girl, but she nearly walked into traffic one morning, said she was following the voices. The confirmation that others had heard the whispers sent a chill through Marcus. Did you ever hear anything unusual from this house? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear what sounded like conversations coming from the basement area. But the Hendersons insisted it was just the old heating system. He looked directly into Marcus's eyes. But heating systems don't call people by name. Marcus thanked Frank and made his way to the house, his equipment bag feeling heavier with each step. The afternoon sun cast different shadows through the windows, making the interior feel less ominous, but no less mysterious. He set up his lights in the main hallway before heading to the basement door. The whispers started as soon as he opened the door, more urgent than the night before. As he descended the stairs, his recording equipment picked up audio that shouldn't have been there. His digital meter showed sound levels that corresponded to normal conversation, yet he could barely make out the words. The basement looked different in bright light. What he had taken for random storage was actually carefully arranged. The books were organized by subject, the paintings were hung with precision, and the furniture was positioned as if someone had been living down here. But it was the far wall that drew his attention immediately. In proper lighting, he could see that the dark stones weren't just different. They were covered in carved symbols that predated any architecture he recognized. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own light, creating patterns that shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them. The thermal camera confirmed what his hand had told him the night before. The wall was radiating heat at a steady 98 degrees, exactly body temperature. Marcus set up his recording equipment and began documenting everything. As he worked, the whispers grew more distinct. He could make out individual voices now, men and women speaking in what sounded like English, but using words and phrases he didn't recognize. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, feeling somewhat foolish but desperate for answers. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then, slowly, a single voice emerged from the others, clearer than any he had heard before. "We are the forgotten," the voice said, definitely female, and carrying an accent he couldn't place. "Trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, bound to this place by circumstance and sorrow." Marcus's hands trembled as he adjusted his recording equipment. "How long have you been here?" "Time has no meaning in our prison. Some of us have been here since the house was built. Others arrived more recently. We are collected here, like books on a shelf, unable to move forward or back. What do you want from me?" The silence stretched so long that Marcus wondered if he had imagined the entire conversation. Then, the voice returned, joined by others, creating a chorus of desperate pleas. "Freedom," they said together. "The wall that binds us grows weaker each year, but it still holds. We need someone from your world, someone with power and resources, to break what was built to contain us." Marcus stared at the carved wall, his rational mind warring with what he was experiencing. "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know releasing you won't cause harm?" Another voice joined the conversation, this one male, and carrying the authority of education. "Because, Mr. Blackwood, we are not evil spirits or demons. We are ordinary people who died in extraordinary circumstances, trapped by a man who feared death so much that he tried to create a prison for souls." "Theodore Ashworth," Marcus whispered, remembering Frank's story. "Yes, he discovered that this location sits on what some call a thin place, where the barrier between worlds is naturally weak. He used this knowledge to trap the souls of those who died in his house, believing that if he could control death itself, he could achieve immortality." Marcus sat down heavily on one of the crates, his mind struggling to process this information. Did it work? In a sense, his consciousness remains in this place, but not as we do. He became something else, something that feeds on the energy of trapped souls. We are his prisoners, and our captivity gives him a form of eternal life. The temperature in the basement seemed to drop as another presence made itself known. Unlike the warm, pleading voices of the trapped souls, This new voice carried a chill that made Marcus's breath visible. "You should not have come here," the cold voice said. And Marcus instinctively knew this was Ashworth. "This place is mine, and these souls are mine. They provide me with the energy I need to continue existing." Marcus stood up, surprised by his own courage. "They don't belong to you. No one belongs to anyone else." Ashworth's laughter echoed through the basement like breaking glass. Spoken like a true capitalist. "You understand ownership, Mr. Blackwood. I invested my entire fortune and my life's work in creating this prison. These souls are the return on my investment." "Your investment was evil," Marcus said firmly. "And I'm going to put an end to it." The cold presence grew stronger, and Marcus could see his breath now. "You think your money gives you power here? You think your worldly success means anything in the face of forces you cannot comprehend? I have been perfecting my control over this realm for over a century and a half." But Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, the warm support of the trapped souls surrounding him. Their whispers became a protective chorus, pushing back against Ashworth's influence. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to fight for something other than profit. "Your century of practice means nothing," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "Because you're still just a man, just like me. And men can be defeated." He picked up the crowbar he had brought and approached the carved wall. The symbols seemed to writhe in the light, and the warmth radiating from the stone increased. The whispers of the trapped souls grew urgent, encouraging him forward. "Yes," said the female voice that had first spoken clearly. "The symbols are the lock. Break them, and we can be free." Marcus raised the crowbar, but Ashworth's voice roared through the basement with supernatural force. "You will destroy yourself if you break that wall. The energy contained within will consume everything in a 5-mile radius." Marcus hesitated, the crowbar suspended above his head. Was this the truth, or was Ashworth lying to protect his prison? The warm female voice spoke softly, meant only for him. "He lies. The energy will be great, but it will be the energy of release, not destruction. We will finally be able to move on to whatever comes next, and his power will be broken forever." The second strike shattered the first symbol completely. Light poured from the crack, not the harsh white of his LED setup, but a warm golden glow that seemed to carry voices within it. Marcus felt a rush of energy that was both exhausting and exhilarating, as if he had just completed the most important task of his life. "One down," whispered the female voice, now filled with hope that made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion he hadn't felt in years. 11 more to go. As he positioned himself to strike the second symbol, the basement began to change around him. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, and Marcus caught glimpses of other times overlaid on the present moment. He saw the basement as it was in 1847, when Theodore Ashworth first carved these symbols with his own hands. He saw the first soul trapped here, a young servant girl who had accidentally discovered Ashworth's experiments with the supernatural. "Her name was Elena," said the warm female voice, and Marcus realized he was speaking with her. "I was only 16, working to support my family. I saw him perform a ritual that should have been impossible, binding the spirit of a recently deceased man to this place." Marcus brought the crowbar down on the second symbol, and the crack of breaking stone was accompanied by Elena's gasp of relief. Through the growing golden light, he could see her face for the first time, young, kind, with eyes that had seen too much suffering but retained their compassion. "He killed me to keep his secret safe," Elena continued as Marcus moved to the third symbol. "Made it look like an accident, but bound my soul here just as he had done to others. I became the first of his permanent prisoners." The third symbol proved more difficult to break. As Marcus struck it repeatedly, Ashworth's presence grew stronger and more desperate. The temperature plummeted so quickly that ice began forming on the walls, and Marcus's breath came out in thick clouds that obscured his vision. "You have no idea what you are releasing," Ashworth's voice boomed from everywhere at once. "These souls have been changed by their captivity. They are no longer the innocent people they once were." But Elena's voice cut through the cold like a warm embrace. "He lies again. We have been sustained by hope and each other. We are exactly who we always were, just trapped in an impossible situation." Marcus finally shattered the third symbol, and more light flooded the basement. He was beginning to see other figures in the golden glow, a middle-aged man in Victorian clothing, a young boy who couldn't have been older than 10, a woman in a nurse's uniform from what looked like the 1940s. "How many of you are there?" Marcus asked as he positioned himself at the fourth symbol. 47 souls from different time periods," answered the man in Victorian clothing. "I am Dr. William Hartwell. I came here in 1889 to investigate reports of supernatural activity for the American Society for Psychical Research. Ashworth trapped me when I grew too close to understanding his methods." Marcus struck the fourth symbol with renewed determination. Each broken symbol seemed to weaken Ashworth's influence while strengthening the trapped souls. The golden light was now bright enough that Marcus could turn off his LED setup, and the basement felt warmer despite the ice on the walls. "The boy is Timothy," Dr. Hartwell continued. "He died of illness in this house in 1923 when it was briefly used as a boarding house. The nurse is Margaret, who came here in 1943 to care for an elderly resident. Each of us died natural deaths, but Ashworth's rituals prevented us from moving on." As Marcus worked on the fifth symbol, he began to understand the true horror of what Ashworth had created. These weren't just trapped souls. They were people who had been denied their natural rest, forced to remain conscious and aware for decades or even centuries, watching the world change through the limited view from this basement. "The worst part," said Margaret, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone accustomed to dealing with suffering, "wasn't the captivity itself. It was watching our families mourn us, seeing our loved ones age and die while we remained frozen in time, unable to offer them any comfort or closure." The fifth symbol cracked under Marcus's assault, and with it came a sound that chilled him more than Ashworth's supernatural cold, the sound of weeping. Not from the trapped souls, but from Ashworth himself. For the first time, the man who had imprisoned these people for his own immortality was showing genuine emotion. "Please," Ashworth's voice had lost its commanding tone and become pleading. "You don't understand what death means to someone who has lived as long as I have. I have seen empires rise and fall, technologies that seemed impossible become commonplace, generations of human progress that astound and terrify me. How can I surrender all of that knowledge and experience to the void?" Marcus paused with the crowbar raised above the sixth symbol. Despite everything Ashworth had done, Marcus recognized the fear in his voice. It was the same fear that had driven Marcus himself to accumulate wealth and power, the terror of insignificance, of being forgotten, of death erasing everything he had worked to build. "I understand your fear," Marcus said to the cold presence. "But look what that fear has cost. Look at the pain you've caused to innocent people just to avoid facing what every human being must eventually face." "Easy words from a man who has never died," Ashworth replied, his voice regaining some of its strength. "You speak of facing death as if it were a noble choice, but you have spent your entire life building walls against mortality, just as I have. Your wealth, your power, your carefully controlled environment, all attempts to deny the random, chaotic nature of death." Marcus felt the truth in Ashworth's words like a physical blow. Wasn't his entire empire built on the same fear that had driven Ashworth to these extremes? Hadn't he spent decades trying to insulate himself from the unpredictability of life, surrounding himself with money and power to create the illusion of control? "The difference," said Elena's voice gently, "is that your walls were built around yourself. His walls imprisoned others." Marcus understood. He brought the crowbar down on the sixth symbol with decisive force, shattering it completely. The golden light was now strong enough that he could see every detail of the basement clearly, and he realized that the trapped souls weren't just voices anymore. They were becoming visible, translucent figures standing around him like a congregation of hope. "7 more," whispered Timothy, the boy who had been trapped here for over a century. Despite his youth, his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature for generations. "7 more, and we can all go home." "Where is home for you now?" Marcus asked as he approached the seventh symbol. "I don't know," Timothy admitted. "But it has to be better than this endless waiting. Even if it's just peaceful sleep, it would be a mercy after so long." Marcus struck the seventh symbol, but this time Ashworth fought back with more than just cold air and threatening words. The basement began to shake violently, and Marcus heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere above. Books fell from their shelves, and one of his LED lights tumbled over, casting wild shadows across the walls. "If I cannot have my immortality," Ashworth screamed, his voice now distorted with rage, "then perhaps no one should leave this place alive." The shaking intensified, and Marcus could hear the groaning of old wood and stone as the house above them began to strain under supernatural forces. Dust and small pieces of debris rained down from the ceiling, and Marcus realized that Ashworth might be willing to bring the entire building down rather than accept defeat. "He's trying to collapse the house," Dr. Hartwell observed with clinical detachment. "If he cannot maintain his prison, he will destroy it, and us with it." But the trapped souls had their own power, drawn from decades of shared suffering and mutual support. Marcus felt their strength flowing into him, steadying his hands and calming his fear. The golden light emanating from the broken symbols began to push back against Ashworth's destructive energy, and the shaking gradually subsided. "He grows weaker with each symbol you break," Margaret explained. "His power comes from our captivity. The more of us you free, the less control he has over this place." Marcus attacked the 8th symbol with renewed vigor. As it cracked and shattered, he saw something that made his heart race. Beyond the growing wall of golden light, he could see the faint outline of a doorway that hadn't been there before. It seemed to lead not into another room, but into someplace else entirely, a space filled with the warm light of peaceful rest. "The passage home," Elena breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "He's actually doing it. After all these years, we're going to be free." The 9th symbol broke more easily than the others, as if Ashworth's resistance was finally crumbling. With its destruction, Marcus could hear new sounds from beyond the wall. Gentle music, voices calling welcome, the sound of winds that carried no earthly scent but smelled like peace itself. "Two more," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the souls or to himself. His arms ached from swinging the crowbar, his clothes were soaked with sweat despite the supernatural cold, and his entire worldview had been demolished and rebuilt in the space of 2 days. But he felt more alive and purposeful than he had since childhood. As he raised the crowbar to strike the 10th symbol, Ashworth made one final, desperate attempt to stop him. Instead of cold and shaking, this time he tried bargaining. "I can make you immortal too." Ashworth's voice was soft, seductive, almost reasonable. "Think of what you could accomplish with unlimited time. Your businesses could span centuries. Your influence could shape the entire future of human civilization. I can teach you the rituals, show you how to bind souls without causing them suffering. We could perfect the system together." Marcus paused, the crowbar suspended in the air. The offer was tempting. The final strike rang out like a bell across the basement, and with it, the last symbol cracked and crumbled into golden dust. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The entire wall began to dissolve, revealing not another room, but a passage that seemed to stretch into infinity, filled with light that was somehow both brilliant and gentle to the eyes. Marcus dropped the crowbar and fell to his knees, exhausted but exhilarated. Around him, the 47 trapped souls began to move toward their freedom with a grace that defied their long captivity. They didn't rush or push. Instead, they walked with dignity and peace, many of them pausing to look back at Marcus with gratitude that needed no words. Elena was the last to approach the passage. She knelt beside Marcus, and for a moment he could see her not as a translucent spirit, but as she must have been in life, vibrant, kind, with a strength that had sustained her and others through more than a century of imprisonment. "You changed everything," she told him, her voice now carrying the music of impending rest. "Not just for us, but for yourself. Can you feel it?" Marcus looked within himself and realized she was right. Something fundamental had shifted in his heart during these past hours. The hollow ache that had driven him to accumulate wealth and power was gone, replaced by something he had never expected to find, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with money or success. "What happens now?" he asked as Elena began to fade, drawn toward the passage by forces he couldn't understand but respected completely. Now you live, she said with a smile that seemed to light up the entire basement. Really live, perhaps for the first time. As the last of the freed souls disappeared into the passage, the golden light began to dim. But, before it faded entirely, Marcus heard one more voice. Ashworth's voice, but changed, no longer cold or threatening. The centuries of anger and fear were gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like relief. "The binding is broken," Ashworth said, and Marcus could hear in those words the exhaustion of a man who had carried an impossible burden for too long. "I can feel it calling to me too, the passage to whatever comes after." I had forgotten that death was not an ending, but a doorway. "Will you go through?" Marcus asked, surprised to find that he felt compassion for the man who had caused so much suffering. There was a long pause before Ashworth answered. "I am afraid. After so long fighting against death, I have forgotten how to surrender to it. But perhaps it is time to remember." Marcus felt Ashworth's presence grow fainter as the ancient soul moved toward the passage. "I am sorry," came the whisper, directed not just at Marcus but at all those who had suffered because of his fear. "I thought controlling death would bring me peace, but it only brought me emptiness. True peace requires letting go." The passage began to close as the last traces of golden light faded from the basement. Marcus found himself alone in the dark, but it was a different kind of darkness than before, natural, peaceful, without the weight of supernatural suffering. He fumbled for his flashlight and made his way back up the stairs, each step feeling like he was ascending from one world into another. The house above seemed different now, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from its very foundations. Sunlight streamed through the windows with a quality that seemed new to Marcus, though he couldn't explain why. He walked through the rooms slowly, processing what had just happened, trying to understand how he could possibly return to his old life after witnessing something so profound. His phone had dozens of missed calls and messages. Sarah had been trying to reach him for hours, worried about his unexplained absence from important meetings. His CFO needed decisions on 3 separate deals. His lawyers required signatures on documents that would net him another $50 million. The world of business and wealth that had once been his entire universe was demanding his attention, but it felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. Marcus stepped outside and found Frank Morrison waiting by the fence, concern evident on the elderly man's face. "I heard some strange noises earlier," Frank said. "Sounded like singing, if you can believe that. Everything all right?" Marcus looked at this man who had lived next to supernatural mystery for decades without ever fully understanding what was happening, yet had sensed enough to know something was wrong. "Everything is more than all right," Marcus said. "The voices you sometimes heard at night, they won't be bothering you anymore." Frank studied Marcus's face with the keen perception of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when a person had been fundamentally changed. "You look different. Peaceful somehow. What happened in that basement?" Marcus considered how to answer. The truth sounded impossible even to him, and he had lived through it. "I found some people who had been trapped for a very long time, and I helped them find their way home." Frank nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. Sometimes the most important work we do is helping others move on when they're ready. It takes courage to assist with that kind of letting go. As Marcus drove away from Elm Street, he realized that Frank was right about courage. It had taken courage to stay in that basement when every rational instinct told him to leave. It had taken courage to believe in voices that shouldn't have existed and to act on that belief. But the greatest courage had come in the moment when he chose to help others find peace, even when he didn't fully understand what that would cost him. Back at his office, Sarah greeted him with a mixture of relief and barely contained frustration. "Mr. Blackwood, the Henderson meeting was supposed to happen 3 hours ago. The Singapore investors are threatening to pull out of the deal, and the board wants to know why you missed the quarterly review without any explanation." Marcus sat down at his desk and looked out the window at the city he had spent decades conquering. The numbers on his computer screen, stock prices, profit margins, market projections, seemed as foreign to him as hieroglyphics. Not meaningless, exactly, but part of a language he was no longer fluent in. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the week." "Sir, that's impossible. You have the merger signing tomorrow, the board presentation on Thursday, and the charity gala on Friday that you're supposed to be hosting. Marcus turned to look at his assistant, this woman who had worked tirelessly for him for 8 years, managing his life with efficiency and dedication. Really looked at her for perhaps the first time, seeing not just a competent employee, but a person with her own dreams, fears, and aspirations. Sarah, how long has it been since you took a real vacation? Not a working vacation or a long weekend, but actual time off where you didn't think about this office at all. She looked confused by the question. I'm not sure that's relevant, Mr. Blackwood. We have urgent matters to answer the question, please. Sarah thought for a moment. About 6 years, I suppose. But I enjoy my work, and there's always so much to do. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed insane to him just days before. I'm giving you a month off, with full pay, starting immediately. Use it however you want. Travel, spend time with family, pursue a hobby, anything that makes you happy. Sir, I don't understand. Have I done something wrong? Is this about missing the calls today? You've done everything right, Sarah. That's exactly the problem. You've been so busy managing my life that you haven't had time to live your own. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. I'm also going to increase your salary by 40%, effective immediately. Sarah stared at him as if he had started speaking in tongues. Mr. Blackwood, are you feeling all right? Should I call Dr. Henderson? Marcus laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. When was the last time he had genuinely laughed in this office? I'm feeling better than I have in 20 years, Sarah. For the first time in my adult life, I understand what's actually important. Over the next several hours, Marcus began systematically restructuring his life in ways that would have shocked his former self. He called the Singapore investors and told them he was no longer interested in their deal, regardless of its profitability. He delegated the merger signing to his vice president with instructions to prioritize fair treatment of employees over maximum profit. He authorized substantial bonuses for his entire staff, not as performance incentives, but simply as recognition of their humanity. Most shocking of all, he began calling charities and community organizations not to arrange tax-deductible donations for publicity purposes, but to ask how he could help solve real problems. He found himself particularly drawn to organizations that helped people deal with loss and grief, understanding now in a way he never had before how important it was to help others find peace during times of transition. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus realized that the whispers from the basement had done more than just alert him to trapped souls. They had shown him that his own soul had been trapped as well, imprisoned by fear and the endless pursuit of security through wealth. The act of freeing those spirits had somehow freed him as well. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thank you. There was no signature, but Marcus somehow knew it was from Elena, sending a final message from whatever realm she had found beyond the passage. The knowledge that the freed souls had found peace filled him with a joy that was completely different from any satisfaction his business successes had ever provided. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same basement where his life had changed forever, but now it served a completely different purpose. The Victorian mansion on Elm Street had been transformed into the Elena Morrison House, a grief counseling center and support facility for families dealing with loss. The basement, once a prison for trapped souls, now housed a library and meditation space where people could find peace and healing. The transformation hadn't been easy. Marcus's sudden shift in priorities had sent shockwaves through his business empire. Several board members had attempted to have him declared mentally incompetent when he announced plans to donate 60% of his wealth to charitable causes. His stock prices had fluctuated wildly as investors tried to understand what they saw as erratic behavior from a previously predictable businessman. But Marcus had held firm, and gradually those around him began to see that his decisions, while unexpected, were not irrational. The companies he retained were restructured to prioritize employee welfare and environmental responsibility alongside profit. His remaining investments were directed toward enterprises that solved real problems rather than simply generating maximum returns. Surprisingly, this approach had proven not only ethically satisfying but also financially successful, as consumers and employees responded positively to businesses that demonstrated genuine care for human welfare. Frank Morrison had become an unexpected ally in the transformation of the house. When Marcus explained his plans to turn the property into a grief counseling center, Frank had volunteered to oversee the construction work, refusing any payment for his efforts. That house took enough from people over the years, Frank had said. Tomek gave something back. The renovation had revealed more about the house's history. In removing decades of accumulated belongings from the basement, workers had discovered Theodore Ashworth's journals, hidden behind a false wall. The documents provided a chilling record of his experiments with soul binding, but they also revealed something Marcus hadn't expected: Ashworth's own journey from curious researcher to obsessed prisoner of his own fears. The journals showed that Ashworth hadn't started as a monster. He had been a brilliant man who became fascinated with the mysteries of death and consciousness after losing his young wife to cholera. His initial experiments had been motivated by grief and love, an attempt to find some way to communicate with the departed. But fear had gradually corrupted his noble intentions, transforming a quest for understanding into a desperate attempt to control forces that were meant to remain beyond human influence. Reading those journals had given Marcus insight into his own transformation. Like Ashworth, he had allowed fear to drive his choices, building walls of wealth and control to protect himself from life's uncertainties. The difference was that Marcus had been given the opportunity to recognize his prison and choose differently. The Elena Morrison house had opened 3 months earlier, staffed by professional grief counselors and volunteers who understood the importance of helping people process loss in healthy ways. Marcus visited regularly, not as the owner or benefactor, but as someone who found meaning in connecting with others who were learning to live with difficult truths. Today marked a special anniversary. It was exactly 1 year since Marcus had first heard the whispers in this basement. He sat quietly in the meditation space, surrounded by comfortable chairs and soft lighting, remembering the fear and wonder he had felt during those first encounters with the impossible. "Mr. Blackwood?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Maria Santos, one of the grief counselors, standing in the doorway. "There's someone here who would like to meet you." Marcus followed Maria upstairs to the main reception area, where a young woman in her 20s was waiting nervously. She had dark hair and kind eyes that reminded him somehow of Elena, though he knew that was probably his imagination. "This is Anna Chun," Maria said. "She's been attending our support groups for the past month." "Anna, this is Marcus Blackwood, the founder of the center." Anna stood up uncertainly. "I hope you don't mind me asking to meet you. I know you must be very busy." "Not at all," Marcus said, gesturing for her to sit back down. "I'm always interested in hearing how the center has been helpful to people." Anna took a deep breath before speaking. "My grandmother passed away 6 months ago, and I was having a really hard time dealing with it. She raised me after my parents died when I was young, and losing her felt like losing my entire world." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Even after a year of working with grieving families, he was still moved by each person's story of loss and healing. "The support groups here have helped me understand that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry," Anna continued. "But that's not why I wanted to meet you. I wanted to tell you about something strange that happened the night before my grandmother died." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. What kind of strange thing? She had been unconscious for days, and the doctors said she probably wouldn't wake up again. But that night, she suddenly opened her eyes and started talking to someone I couldn't see. She called them by name, people I recognized from her stories about friends and family who had died years before. Anna paused, clearly struggling with whether to continue. "I know how this sounds, but..." She seemed to be having actual conversations with them. And then she looked right at me and said, "Don't be afraid, Anna. They're here to help me cross over. There's a place where people go when they're ready to let go, and someone very kind has made sure the way is clear." Marcus's hands began to tremble slightly. Did she say anything else? She said that sometimes souls get trapped between worlds, but that a good man had recently freed many people who had been waiting a long time to find peace. She told me that because of his courage, the passage was open and safe for others like her. The room seemed to spin slightly around Marcus. After a year, he had almost convinced himself that the events in the basement had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But Anna's story suggested that the effects of freeing those trapped souls had rippled outward in ways he had never imagined. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman," Marcus managed to say. "She was. And she died peacefully an hour after that conversation, with a smile on her face like she was going to meet old friends." Anna looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I don't know what happened in this house before it became a counseling center, but I wanted you to know that your work here is connected to something much larger than just helping people deal with grief." After Anna left, Marcus returned to the basement meditation room and sat in silence for a long time. The idea that Elena and the other freed souls had somehow made the passage between worlds easier for others to navigate filled him with a sense of completion he hadn't expected. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, who had returned from her month-long vacation transformed and energized, eventually becoming the director of operations for all of Marcus's charitable endeavors. The quarterly reports are in. The Elena Morrison House has helped over 300 families in its first 3 months. The attached community center has provided job training to 150 people. And the scholarship fund has enabled 75 students from low-income families to attend college. Thought you'd want to know the numbers. Marcus smiled at the message. Sarah had learned to communicate with him in the language he understood best, concrete results that demonstrated real impact. But these numbers meant something completely different from the profit margins and stock prices that had once defined success for him. 300 families helped through their darkest moments. 150 people given new opportunities for economic stability. 75 young people able to pursue education that would transform their futures. These weren't just statistics. They were individual human beings whose lives had been touched by the decision to transform pain into purpose. As evening approached, Marcus walked through the house one final time before leaving. In the main counseling room, he could see a support group meeting in progress. 8 people sitting in a circle sharing their stories of loss and slowly learning how to rebuild their lives. In the children's activity room, a young boy was drawing pictures while his mother met with a counselor about processing the death of his father. This was what the whispers had been calling him toward, Marcus realized. Not just the dramatic act of freeing trapped souls, but the ongoing work of helping living people find their way through the darkness of grief and loss. "It's like the ground here is particularly fertile now, like something that was blocking growth has been cleared away." Marcus nodded, understanding the metaphor in ways that Frank might not have intended. The ground of his own life had become more fertile too, capable of supporting growth that would have been impossible when his heart was frozen by fear and greed. As he drove home that evening, Marcus reflected on the year since he had first heard his name whispered from below the earth. The man who had descended those basement stairs had been successful by every conventional measure, but had been slowly dying inside, trapped by his own fears just as surely as the souls behind that carved wall. The man driving home now was wealthier in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. He had meaningful work that connected him to others. He had relationships based on mutual care rather than mutual benefit. He had purpose that extended beyond his own survival and comfort. Most importantly, he had learned the difference between accumulating power and actually making a difference. The whispers had stopped, but Marcus carried their message with him every day, that the greatest treasures in life were often found not by climbing higher but by digging deeper, not by building walls but by tearing them down, and not by trying to control the uncontrollable, but by choosing to help others navigate the mysteries they couldn't control either. Marcus Blackwood had heard strange whispers from below, and they had indeed shaken his heart. But in breaking open to that trembling, he had discovered something he had never expected to find, a life worth living, built not on the foundation of what he could take from the world, but on what he could give to it. The billionaire who had once seen other people as obstacles or opportunities now understood that they were the point entirely. And in learning to truly see others, he had finally learned to see himself clearly too, not as a master of the universe, but as one human being among many, each carrying their own sorrows and hopes, each deserving of dignity and care. The whispers had led him home to his own humanity, and in that homecoming, Marcus had found the peace that no amount of money had ever been able to purchase. That evening, Instead of attending a networking dinner with potential investors, Marcus drove to a small restaurant in the part of town he had never visited. He ate alone, but not lonely, watching ordinary people live their ordinary lives with a fascination he had never experienced before. A young couple celebrating an anniversary, an elderly man reading a book while nursing a cup of coffee, a waitress who treated every customer with genuine warmth despite obviously being tired from a long shift. These were the people his old life had been insulated from, the people whose lives his wealth had made it possible to ignore. Now he saw them clearly for the first time, and understood that their struggles and joys were not background noise to his more important pursuits, but the actual substance of human existence. As he walked back to his car, Marcus felt the phantom warmth on his palm again, the lingering sensation from touching that impossible wall. But now he understood what that warmth had really been. The combined strength of 47 souls who had refused to let captivity destroy their capacity for hope and connection. They had shown him that even in the darkest circumstances, people could maintain their essential humanity. Marcus Blackwood went to sleep that night in the same bed he had slept in for 5 years, but he was no longer the same man. The whispers had stopped, but their echo remained in his heart, a constant reminder that the most valuable things in life could never be bought, sold, or controlled, only given freely and received with gratitude. In a way that terrified him. How many problems could he solve with unlimited time? How much good could he do if he didn't have to worry about the constraints of a single human lifespan? But then he looked at the faces surrounding him: Elena, Dr. Hartwell, Timothy, Margaret, and all the others. They had been robbed of their natural endings, denied the peace that should come after a life well lived. Whatever good Ashworth claimed he could accomplish with immortality, it could never justify the suffering he had caused. Some things are more important than time, Marcus said, and brought the crowbar down on the 10th symbol with all his remaining strength. The symbol didn't just break. It exploded into fragments that turned to golden dust before they hit the ground. The light from the wall became so bright that Marcus had to shield his eyes, and he felt a rushing sensation as if a great wind was flowing through the basement toward the mysterious doorway beyond the wall. One symbol remained, but Marcus could already see that the prison was breaking apart. The trapped souls were beginning to move toward the passage, their faces radiant with joy and relief. Elena paused beside him, her translucent hand touching his shoulder with warmth he could actually feel. "Thank you," she said simply. "You gave us back our endings." Marcus raised the crowbar one last time, tears streaming down his face as he prepared to complete the most important work of his life. Marcus looked around the basement, at the recording equipment that had captured impossible conversations, at the thermal readings that defied physics, at the carved wall that radiated living warmth. Everything about this situation challenged the ordered, logical world he had spent decades building around himself. But, for the first time since childhood, Marcus realized that logic and order weren't the only forces in the universe. Standing in that basement, surrounded by voices of people who had been trapped for generations, he understood that some things were more important than safety, more important than wealth, more important than his own carefully constructed life. He brought the crowbar down against the first symbol with all his strength. The impact sent shockwaves through the basement, and a sound like singing filled the air. The symbol cracked, but didn't break completely. "Stop." Ashworth's voice was filled with genuine panic now. "You don't understand what you're doing." But Marcus understood perfectly. For the first time in his adult life, he was doing something that mattered more than money, more than power, more than his own security. He raised the crowbar again, and this time the trapped souls added their strength to his, their whispers becoming a unified song of hope and determination. When he finally emerged from the basement, dawn was breaking over the city. Marcus stood in the mansion's front yard, looking up at the sky with eyes that seemed to see color for the first time in decades. The whispers had followed him partway up the stairs before fading, but their echo remained in his mind like a song he couldn't forget. He drove home slowly, his hands still tingling from the warmth of that impossible wall. Sarah would be worried. He had missed 3 important calls and a dinner meeting with potential investors. But, for once in his life, Blackwood didn't care about the money he might have lost or the deals that might have fallen through. Something fundamental had shifted in the basement of that Victorian house. The man who descended those stairs was not the same man who climbed back up. Marcus had spent his entire adult life in control, manipulating markets and people with calculated precision. But the whispers had shown him a world where control was an illusion and money meant nothing. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. Tomorrow, he would go back to that basement. He would bring proper lighting, recording equipment, and anything else that might help him understand what he had experienced. For the first time in 20 years, he had encountered something that couldn't be bought, sold, or leveraged. The whispers had awakened something in Marcus Blackwood that he thought had died long ago. Wonder. And with that wonder came a hunger he hadn't felt since childhood. The desperate need to understand, to explore, to discover truth rather than profit. He sat in his car for a long moment before going inside, still feeling the phantom warmth on his palm. Whatever waited for him in that basement, whatever those voices represented, had become more important than any deal he had ever made. The billionaire who had conquered financial markets was about to embark on a very different kind of conquest, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality itself. The morning sun climbed higher as Marcus finally went inside, already planning his return to the house on Elm Street. He didn't know that his life had just taken a turn that would either destroy him or transform him into something entirely new. All he knew was that for the first time in decades, he felt truly, completely alive.